The morning light streamed into my studio, golden and warm, turning the terracotta tiles underfoot into a patchwork of sunlight patterns. The soft hum of the Mediterranean breeze carried the mingling scenes of salt water and blooming orange blossoms drifting through the open windows, like an uninvited but welcome guest. My hands were slick with clay fingers, gently shaping a vase that seemed to flow naturally from my fingertips. It was moments like these that made me feel at peace, content even, like here was simple, predictable, every morning. I greeted the sun with the same routine, opened the shutters to let the light in, brew a pot of strong coffee, and immerse myself in my work. The studio, with its view of the turquoise sea stretching endlessly into the horizon, had become my sanctuary, my fresh start. But no matter how much I shaped my days as carefully as I shaped my clay, there were moments of stillness that felt heavy. Moments when the echoes of my old life crept in, the sharp edges of betrayal, the memory of demands to set. It had been 5 years, but the scars remained faint but unyielding. I had filled my days with purpose and creativity, yet there was a part of me that longed for connection, for something or someone to iffy the quiet ache that lingered just beneath the surface. The sudden trill of the doorbell jolted me from my thoughts. My hands froze, suspended over the spinning clay, as I glanced toward the entrance. It wasn't unusual for tourists to wander in, drawn by curiosity or the promise of a unique souvenir. But this time there was no burst of cheerful chatter or hurried footsteps when the door swung open. My heart stuttered. Adrian stood there, framed by the bright Mediterranean sun behind him, his silhouette familiar yet somehow foreign. For a moment I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. He wore a slightly wrinkled linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbow, and carried a single travel bag slung over his shoulder. His dark hair was windswept, his jawline more defined than I remembered, but his expression, part hesitance, part relief, was unmistakably his Adrian. I whispered, my voice catching. "Gabriella," he said, his tone low and warm, though tinged with uncertainty. He took a tentative step inside, his gaze sweeping over the room before landing on me. My pulse quickened, a mix of surprise and something else, something I couldn't quite name, flooding through me. Adrian and I had always been cordial, polite even, but distant. Growing up in separate households meant that we were more acquaintances than family. I hadn't seen him in years, and yet here he was, standing in the middle of my studio, looking as if he traveled through storms just to get here. I wiped my hands on my apron, the clay smearing across the fabric as I moved toward him. "What are you doing here?" He hesitated, his shoulders sagging slightly, as if the weight of whatever had brought him here was too much to bear. "I needed to get away," he admitted. "Madrid, everything there, it's too much right now. I thought..." He trailed off, his voice faltering. "I thought maybe I could come here, see you." The rawness in his tone surprised me, and my chest tightened at the vulnerability in his words. "Adrian," I murmured, stepping closer. His eyes met mine, then dark and searching. And for the first time, I saw the exhaustion etched into his face, the faint shadows under his eyes, the tension in his jaw. I couldn't stop myself. I reached out my hand, brushing his arm in an instinctive gesture of comfort. His lips curved into a small, tired smile. "You haven't changed," he said softly, a sudden wave of emotion. "I didn't dare name you have," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. He let out a breath, almost a laugh, and before I could stop myself, I stepped closer, wrapping my arms around him in a tentative embrace. He stiffened for a moment before melting into the hug, his arms sliding around my waist. The warmth of his body against mine was startling, grounding. "I've missed you," he murmured, his voice muffled against my hair. I pulled back slightly, just enough to meet his gaze. The air between us shifted, thick with unspoken words. His hand lifted, brushing a stray curl from my face, and my breath caught as his fingers lingered against my cheek. "I've missed you too," I admitted, my voice trembling with a mix of honesty and uncertainty. and then without warning, he leaned in, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was hesitant but deeply felt. It was a kiss born of years apart, of shared loneliness and an unspoken connection that neither of us had acknowledged before. When we broke apart, the word world seemed quieter, the air heavier. He searched my face, his expression unreadable, and I found myself unable to look away. "Welcome back," I finally said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Thank you," he replied, his lips curving into a faint smile. As he set his bag down and stepped fully into the studio, I couldn't shake the feeling that his arrival marked the beginning of something neither of us was prepared for. Adrian settled into life at my studio as though he had always been part of it, yet there was an undeniable newness to having him here. Our days began to take on a rhythm, mornings with coffee on the terrace, afternoons and strolling through the bustling market streets, and evenings sitting quietly under the stars. It was comforting, even if we were both careful to avoid digging too deeply into the weight of what had brought us together in this quiet coastal town. But it was one particular evening that changed everything. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the studio. The warmth of the day lingered in the air as I suggested a walk along the rugged coastline just beyond the town's edge. It was a favorite spot of mine, a place where the crushing waves and the endless sky seemed to drown out every troubling thought. Aidan agreed. With a small nod, and we set off together. The path was uneven, littered with loose stones and patches of slick moss. I led the way, pointing out landmarks and sharing small anecdotes about the area. Adrian listened with a soft smile, his hands tucked casually into his pockets, but his eyes didn't miss a thing as we rounded a corner, where the cliff dipped closer to the sea. My foot caught on a wet rock. It happened so quickly, I barely had time to react. One moment I was upright, and the next my ankle twisted painfully, and I fell forward with a startled cry. Gabriella, Adrian, was at my side in an instant, his hand steadying me as I tried and failed to get back on my feet. A sharp, throbbing pain through my ankle, and I winced, biting back a groan. "I think I twisted it," I said through clenched teeth, gripping his arm for support. "Don't move," he said firmly, crouching beside me. His hands were gentle but sure as he examined my ankle, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It's already swelling. You shouldn't try to walk on it." "I can make it back," I protested weakly, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. "No, you can't," he said, his tone broken. "No? Argument without another word?" He slipped one arm beneath my knees and the other around my back. "Adrian, you don't have to stop arguing," he interrupted. Lifting me effortlessly, "I've got you." The heat of his body pressed against mine was startling, and I clung to his shoulders instinctively as he carried me back to the studio. His jaw was set, his focus entirely on the path ahead. And then I couldn't help but notice the strength in his arms, the steadiness of his hold once inside. Adrian carefully set me down on the bed in the guest room, his movements deliberate and precise. "Stay here," he said, disappearing for a moment before returning with a towel-wrapped bag of ice. He eased my foot onto a pillow, gently pressing the ice against the swollen area. I hissed at the sudden chill, but his hands were quick to steady me. "Easy," he murmured, his voice low and soothing. "This will help with the swelling." He stayed by my side, his fingers brushing over my skin. As he adjusted the ice pack after a while, he set it aside and began to massage the area around the injury. His touch, firm but careful, the tension in my muscles slowly melted under his hands, replaced by a warmth that spread through me like a slow burning fire. "You're good at this," I said softly, my voice tinged with gratitude. He glanced up at me, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Architects need steady hands," he said, "but I'm glad it helps." "It does," I admit, meeting his gaze. "Thank you, Adrian, for everything." He shrugged as if it were nothing, but there was a tenderness in his expression that made my chest tighten, unable to stop myself. I leaned forward, brushing my lips against his cheek in a gesture of gratitude. He froze for a moment, his eyes widening slightly as he turned to look at me. Our faces were so close now that I could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, feel the warmth of his breath against my skin. And then, as if drawn by some invisible force, I closed the distance between us, pressing my lips softly to his. It wasn't planned or calculated, it was a spontaneous expression of the emotions that had been building since he arrived. For a moment he didn't move, but then his hand came up to cradle my face, and he kissed me back. This kiss was unhurried, lingering, and filled with a quiet intensity that left me breathless. When we finally pulled apart, the air between us felt charged, heavy with the weight of what had just happened. His thumb brushed against my cheek, his eyes searching mine. "Gabriella," he began, but whatever he was going to say trailed off into silence. I reached up, my fingers grazing his. "It's okay," I whispered. "Let us not overthink it right now." He nodded slowly, his gaze softening. "You should rest," he said gently, tucking the blanket around me as he stood and stepped away. I watched him go, my heart still racing. Whatever had just happened between us, it felt like a door opening to something neither of us had expected, but something we could no longer ignore. The day passed in a strange, unspoken rhythm between us, the memory of the previous evening lingering like a soft haze in the corners of my mind. Adrian moved through the studio with quiet purpose, his presence filling the spaces that once felt too large, too empty. I couldn't help but watch him as he worked his movements, deliberate yet unhurried, as if he belonged here more than he realized. The swelling in my ankle made any real activity impossible, confining me to the sofa or the bed, and Adrian seemed intent on ensuring. I stayed put. He brought me coffee in the morning, propped pillows beneath my leg, and adjusted the ice pack with a careful touch. I wasn't used to being cared for like this, and it left me feeling both comforted and unsettled. By the afternoon, the soft ache of my ankle had dulled into a persistent throb. Adrian suggested I distract myself with a movie, and I agreed, more to please him than out of any real desire to watch. He selected something I vaguely recognized. Something he said grounded him, though he didn't elaborate as the film played. I found myself studying him more than the story unfolding on the screen. The way his expression softened at moments of levity, the brief flicker of melancholy in his eyes during more somber scenes. It all spoke of a depth I hadn't taken the time to notice before he sat close, but perhaps not too close, his arm resting along the back of the sofa, his attention focused entirely on the screen. I wanted to ask him why he had come here, why he had chosen my quiet little studio as a sanctuary, but the questions felt too heavy, too intrusive. Instead, I let the silence settle around us, broken only by the hum of a television and the occasional sound of waves crashing in the distance. When the movie ended, the air between us felt charged, as if the quiet moments we had shared had spoken louder than any conversation ever could. Adrian stood and helped me to my room. His hand firm and steady as he guided me, he insisted on checking my ankle again, his concern evident in every careful movement. I lay back against the pillows as he applied a fresh ice pack, his hands warm against my skin. His touch was measured, almost clinical, yet there was an underlying tenderness that sent a strange warmth coursing through me. He began to massage the area around the swelling, his fingers moving with a precision that surprised me. I couldn't help but think about how natural this felt, how easily he had slipped into this role of caretaker. He didn't seem to resent it, didn't make me feel as though I were a burden. It was an unfamiliar feeling, one that both comforted and unsettled me in equal measure. As he finished, his gaze lingered on me, his expression unreadable. There was something in the way he looked at me, a quiet intensity that made my breath hitch without thinking. I reached for him, my hand brushing against his, and then it happened. I leaned forward, intending only to offer a small gesture of gratitude, a kiss on the cheek for everything he had done. But as I moved closer, he turned toward me, and our lips met instead. The kiss was soft, almost hesitant at first, as though we were both testing the waters, but then it deepened, his hand coming up to cradle my face, his touch firm yet impossibly gentle. My heart raced, the world around us, fading into nothingness as we lost ourselves in the moment. When we finally pulled apart, I felt a strange mixture of exhilaration and uncertainty. His forehead rested lightly against mine, his breath warm against my skin. Neither of us spoke, but there was no need for words. The connection between us was undeniable, even if it defied logic. Even if it raised questions neither of us was ready to answer. As he stepped back, his hand lingering on my arm for a moment longer than necessary, I felt the weight of his absence, even before he left the room. I lay there in the quiet, my thoughts a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't quite name. The kiss had changed something between us, something I wasn't ready to face, but I knew there was no going back now. The days that followed blurred into a quiet harmony, with Adrian and I finding an unspoken rhythm in the studio. My ankle, though healing, kept me seated for much of the time, which only seemed to amplify Adrian's attentiveness. He had taken to helping with everything, mixing clay, arranging tools, and even cleaning the counters that always seemed to collect a fine layer of dust. But it wasn't just the practical help that struck me. It was the way he seemed to inhabit the space, his presence breathing new life into the quiet solitude. I had grown so accustomed to one morning as sunlight poured through the wide open windows, Adrian suggested we start a collaborative project to keep ourselves occupied. His idea was simple yet intriguing. I would create a series of ceramic sculptures. He would write accompanying short stories inspired by each piece. At first I hesitated. I wasn't sure if I was ready to share the vulnerability of my art in such an intimate way, but his enthusiasm was contagious. He had already begun sketching ideas on a notepad, his brow furrowed in concentration, and I found myself nodding before I could second-guess the decision. The first few days were spent brainstorming themes and designs. Adrian's stories were imaginative and poignant, weaving narratives that gave my sculptures a new depth. I found myself captivated by his words, the way he could transform a simple vase into a vessel of memories, or a small figurine into a symbol of unspoken longing. As we worked, the studio filled with laughter and quiet conversations. There was a lightness in the air that hadn't been there before, a sense of shared purpose that felt almost intoxicating. The boundaries between us blurred further with each passing day, the kiss we had shared lingering in the corners of my mind, unacknowledged but never forgotten. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned shades of pink, but I still remembered the night you told me orange. Adrian suggested we celebrate the completion of our first piece. He insisted on preparing a special dinner, waving off my protest with a grin that left no room for argument. I watched from the doorway as he moved about the kitchen with surprising ease, his sleeves rolled up and his hair slightly tousled. The scent of roasted herbs and freshly baked bread filled the air, mingling with the salty breeze drifting in through the open windows. When he finally called me to the table, I was greeted by the warm glow of candlelight and a meal that looked like it belonged in a restaurant. I couldn't help but smile at the effort he had put into it, the thoughtfulness of every detail as we ate. The conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from childhood memories to dreams for the future. There was a warmth in his eyes that made my heart ache, a vulnerability that mirrored my own. When the meal was over, Adrian stood and walked to the counter, returning with 2 glasses of wine. He handed one to me and raised his own in a quiet toast, the flicker of a candlelight casting shadows across his face for a moment. We simply sat there, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. Then, as if drawn by some invisible force, he leaned toward me, his gaze locking with mine. I didn't pull away. His lips found mine with a certainty that took my breath away. the kiss deeper and more deliberate than the last. His hand cued my cheek, his touch both tender and possessive as if he was afraid to let go. Time seemed to stand still, the world around us, fading into nothingness when we finally broke apart. His forehead rested against mine, our breaths mingling in the stillness. There was no need for words. Everything we felt was written in the quiet intimacy of that moment. The night stretched on, the studio bathed in the soft glow of the candles. Whatever boundaries had existed between us before had dissolved entirely, leaving only the fragile yet undeniable connection that neither of us could ignore. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen, truly understood. And as I sat there, my hand still resting in his, I knew that whatever lay ahead, we would face it together. The studio had grown quieter in recent days, though Adrian's presence still lingered in every corner. My ankle had nearly healed, and I was once again finding my rhythm, shaping clay and letting my thoughts drift with the tide of the sea outside, yet my mind remained restless, occupied by the unspoken truth between us. I hadn't anticipated the depth of connection that had formed when Adrian first arrived. I thought of him as family in the loosest sense, my stepbrother, someone with whom I shared a history that barely overlapped. But now every glance, every touch, every lingering moment told a different story, one that defied explanation and left me questioning everything. I thought I understood about boundaries and relationships. I found myself overthinking even the simplest gestures, his hand brushing against mine as he handed me a cup of tea, the way his eyes lingered on me when he thought I wasn't looking, the way he'd pull away only to drift back into my orbit, as if drawn by some invisible force. It wasn't just the kisses we had shared, though those lingered. In my memory, vivid and unshakable, it was the way he fit so naturally into my life, filling the spaces I hadn't realized were empty, and that terrified me. I told myself it was temporary, that his time here was a fleeting pause in his busy, demanding life. He had his work, his ambitions, his world outside of this quiet coastal town. Yet, the idea of him leaving felt like a weight pressing against my chest, growing heavier with each passing day. That weight became unbearable. The morning Adrian approached me with a decision. His expression was unusually serious, his movements measured as though he carried a burden. He didn't need to say it outright. I could see it in the way he avoided my eyes, the way his hands fidgeted at his sides. He was leaving. I nodded, pretending to understand, pretending it didn't matter as much as it did of late. Of course, he couldn't stay here forever. This life wasn't his, it was mine. Yet as he spoke about returning to Madrid, about the projects waiting for him, and the life he put on hold, I couldn't help but feel a hollow ache in my chest that evening. I found myself pacing the terrace, the breeze carrying the scent of a sea, and the faint hum of distant laughter from the town below. My thoughts were a tangled mess, emotions I couldn't quite numb swirling within me. Adrian found me there, his presence a quiet comfort, even as tension hung between us. He stood beside me, silent, the weight of the moment pressing against us both. I wanted to say something, anything, to convince him to stay, but the words refused to come. Then, as if drawn by some unspoken need, I turned to face him. His eyes met mine, filled with a mix of determination, something softer, something vulnerable. He reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady, grounding me in the chaos of my thoughts before. I could stop myself. I leaned in, closing the distance between us. My lips found his in a kiss that was as much an expression of gratitude as it was a plea for him to stay. His response was immediate, his hands cradling my face as he deepened the kiss, pouring into it. Everything he couldn't say aloud when we finally pulled apart. His forehead rested against mine, our breaths mingling in the cool night air. His hands lingered on my cheeks, his touch gentle yet firm, as if anchoring himself to the moment. I was sure I had to leave, he murmured, his voice soft but steady. But now I don't know. We stood there for what felt like hours, the world around us fading into the background. The certainty of his departure seemed to waver, replaced by an unspoken possibility that perhaps, just perhaps, he didn't have to leave at all that night. Adrian didn't pack his bags instead. He stayed, and though he didn't say it outright, I sensed he was beginning to see the quiet town, this life we had shared for a brief moment, as something more than a temporary escape, perhaps like me. He was starting to wonder if this could be home Adrian stayed, though his time here was still supposed to be temporary. I could see the way he was trying to navigate the space between us, as though every moment held the possibility of becoming something more. But there was no rush now. No need for anything to change too abruptly. We slipped into a new routine. Mornings were still the same, with the sea stretching out before us in all its tranquil glory. But now there was a sense of anticipation in the air, something unspoken but tangible. Adrian helped me with the studio more than ever, not because it was necessary, but because he simply wanted to be near me. His laughter echoed in the studio, mingling with the soft sound of the pottery, wheel turning, and I found myself savoring the little things. The way he would pause to look at me with that same coolness, the way he would pause to look at me with that same searching expression. But it wasn't just the moments spent in the studio that drew us closer. It was everything. The late nights when we sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the stars above, and speaking in hushed tones about things that mattered and things that didn't. The walks we took along the shore where the sand clung to our feet and the waves lapped at our ankles. Sometimes the silence between us was thick with emotions we didn't yet have words for, but there was no discomfort in it. Instead, there was a deep sense of knowing. One evening, after a particularly long day in the studio, we sat down to eat together. The table was simple: bread, cheese, fresh fruit, but the warmth between us made it feel like a feast. Adrian was unusually quiet, lost in thought as he poked at his food. I studied him for a moment, wondering what he was thinking. The past week had changed something in both of us, but neither of us had yet put a name to it. Maybe we didn't need to when the meal ended and the last of the wine was poured. I stood to clear the table. Adrian followed me into the kitchen, his movements fluid but his expression serious. He began, his voice softer than usual. I've been thinking a lot about this, about being here. I turned to face him, my heart skipping a beat. He was looking at me, but there was something uncertain in his eyes, something that spoke of vulnerability. I don't know what it is about this place, he continued, stepping closer, or about you, but I can't seem to picture myself anywhere else right now. Before I could respond, his hand found mine, a gentle squeeze that spoke volumes. And in that moment, I knew he wasn't just talking about staying for another week or another month. He was talking about staying for good in a life that was beginning to take shape between us. He kissed me then, not in the tentative way we had before, but with a sense of certainty, as though this kiss was a promise, a quiet declaration of everything that had built up between us in the days since he decided not to leave. His hands were warm against my back, pulling me closer, as though he couldn't get enough of me. And as you just saw, I finally dared to look at him, and I felt the same when the kiss broke. He didn't pull away. Instead, he held me close, his arms wrapped around me, like he never wanted to let go. I think I could stay here forever, he whispered, his words a soft echo in the stillness of the kitchen. And in that moment, I realized that I felt the same. Whatever had brought us here, whatever complexities our connection held, it no longer mattered. We had found something real in the space between us, something strong enough to weather any storm. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I was no longer afraid. Adrian had become a part of my life in ways I hadn't expected. And as I stood there, wrapped in his arms, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together. There were no more doubts, no more second guessing. The life I had built on my own had become something even more beautiful with him in it. And perhaps in the end, that was the greatest gift of all, a new beginning, full of endless possibilities.